I'm Bob Goodlatte. I'm a former member of Congress, former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and a senior policy advisor to the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability, a nonpartisan nonprofit that focuses on government surveillance reform and issues related to the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects all Americans against unreasonable searches and seizures. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Sean Vitka, who is with Demand Progress, and we work together on a more than weekly basis on these issues. So, Sean, let you introduce yourself and say a word about Demand Progress and Demand Progress's interest in government surveillance reform.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. So my name is Sean Vitka. I work for Demand Progress. We're a netroots group. We've got over 1 million members across the country, and we have a focus on almost anything internet focused. And so my job is particularly in the national security world, and in particular surveillance. And drilling down a little bit more, surveillance of people in the United States, especially without a warrant. So it's great to work with Bob. It's great to be on the podcast, and looking forward to that work continuing.
Great, thank you. And say a word about the coalition that both Demand Progress and PPSA work with. Who are some of the other organizations that are involved, and how broad across the political spectrum do they cover?
Yeah, I mean, this is a culmination really of work that started, more than a decade ago, but that has really been kind of, I think, leading to where we are now. And it ranges from the ACLU and the Brennan Center to Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works. I think we're really extremely lucky to have such a committed cross-partisan alliance on these issues. I think it's really the only way we're going to see success on these issues for a variety of reasons that we might get into later. But the coalition itself does really work that I'm really proud of, frankly, that I think we should all be proud of. And I would say this in terms of some of the issues that we're going to talk about during this show, or I expect we'll talk about during this show. This is the coalition that is guiding a tremendous amount of that work forward, which we're lucky to have that responsibility, and it's also no small responsibility either.
Absolutely. And say a word about why it is you think that groups, literally conservative groups like Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works, and progressive groups like ACLU and Demand Progress, and others that are a part of this coalition, all are worried about government surveillance. It ties right into your netroots work with the internet, and say a word about how the government gathers information about people that they may or may not be aware of what's happening to them.
Absolutely. Well, I think there are so many reasons why we end up in this particular fight together. So I'll hit a couple of the peaks without wanting to suggest that it's all encompassing. On one side, I think there is no monopoly on being wrongfully surveilled by the government by either side of the political aisle. There are movements on the right that have been wrongfully surveilled. There are movements on the left that have been wrongfully surveilled. And that, of course, brings it very much home. In addition to that, the folks that we work with, as Bob knows, are, I think, personally very committed to this work. There is, once you get close to the details, I hate to put it this way, but I think it's true. Once you get close to the details, you go, there aren't really, let me put it this way. A dedicated bad actor could weaponize this, the current surveillance apparatus in an extraordinarily painful way. And I just don't think there's any way to overstate how big a concern that is for anybody who does this work. There are small versions of that. There are big versions of that. There are versions that have actually come to light. I mean, the mass surveillance of all telephone records across the United States by the major telephone providers in any event, that was really quite an egregious overstep by the government. And that was kind of procedural. That was like less of a single person trying to do a bad thing and more of a bad legal theory that got used for all it was worth. the thing that keeps me up at night really is the version where it's a very bad actor, where you have an attorney general or a director of national intelligence that's really willing to bend the current system in their favor, especially for potentially political purposes. Um, that we just cannot stand back and wait for that to happen. And I'm afraid that the system we have set up is effectively playing into that. And
And
sorry, and going back to the coalition, I'd like to think that everybody shares that fear. I think that everybody sees that that is more possible than we would like to admit.
sure, and I think that you're right. The bad actors can appear in any administration of any political party, and they can appear at the federal, state, and local levels of government too. It is not just about the Department of Justice and the FBI or the NSA, where there are bad actors, where there are plenty of documented cases where people have used the ability to surveil other people in ways that were not intended by the Congress when they wrote the laws that created these agencies for the purpose of preventing terrorist attacks, keeping us safe, fighting crime, all legitimate purposes, but all have to operate under the United States Constitution, in particular our Bill of Rights and the Fourth Amendment, which requires that in most circumstances, government get a warrant to gather information about people. So some of those areas where they gather information are any smart device that you own. It doesn't just have to be your computer or your telephone. It could be your refrigerator or just about anything that's gathering information, anything that's operated on an app that's gathering information. And then that can be sold by data brokers. And unfortunately, one of the things that some governments and government agencies think they can do is to simply go around the Fourth Amendment and buy information from third parties. Another is to collect it using devices like stingrays. You might want to explain to our viewers what a stingray is and how it works on each and every one of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll even scope out a little bit before zooming back specifically onto stingrays. The technology that we've seen deployed, and I would say just the general the apparent target, if you will, of the new policies and new technologies that the government is deploying to conduct surveillance. It's clearly got to be a feature. It keeps showing up. A consistent theme of these devices and policies, if you will, is over collection. And before going to stingrays, which I think is a perfect example of that, something that you and I actually haven't had a chance to catch up on is there was a facial recognition story that just came out of Madison Square Garden. Theoretically, it's a fantastic Politico piece, and the short form is I think the title is about how it was a Girl Scout mom, something in that territory, or maybe it was a Boy Scout mom, got pulled out of or got prevented from going to a concert at Madison Square Garden because the facial recognition identified her as a lawyer working for a firm that was suing the owners of Madison Square Garden. And so this is not how these things are marketed. This is not how governments defend, warrantless surveillance of people. This is a private company doing it, but they're in a similar dynamic. They're saying, no, we have this here to keep you safe. Well, there are also just very powerful interests on the other side of this who have their own goals, and sometimes it's let's keep the lawyers who are suing us out of our building. And again, I could kind of care less about exactly how that one interaction or that one relationship how bad it is, but I care very deeply about the idea that we're getting told one thing and then going to see ramifications for years and years and years, hopefully not forever, that look like something else. Going to stingrays, though, it's really I think a terrifying example of what we're both talking about here. This is Stingray is actually a proprietary name. It's kind of the last gen, but it's the shorthand for what are called IMSI catchers. These are basically devices that intercept, play a man in the middle role, if you're familiar with that term. It's an attack term between a cell phone and a cell tower. And basically it says, look, I'm a cell tower. You can connect to me and continue, and operate like a phone. And turns out our cell phones are not, brilliant devices, and they will say yes to any tower that says, yes, I'm an AT&T tower. And in what that produces is these are government devices much more than private devices, as far as we know. What we end up with is a government ability to sift through in the process of routing that connection back to the actual tower that the phone was trying to connect to. But going to the point of over collection, these are not pinpoint devices. They can be configured to be very, very narrow, but their capacity is very much for anything in like a mile radius of the device, right? And we've seen, if you're interested in this, I don't want to go too long on it, but Baltimore is a case study in how these things are wrongfully used and how pernicious they can be. You just have a stunning example in Baltimore over the years of over deployment, in particular of historically targeted communities, and this is local law enforcement. These are your beat cops. These are people, or this is the Boston Police Department. This isn't a federal government move, and yet they're still capable, with almost a trivial amount of money, to become this really massive threat to to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people's privacy on a whim. And that we can't accept that.
Absolutely. So your cell phone, your automobile, your household devices, certainly any kind of computer communications, all generate information of various types that's very useful for a lot of purposes. We're not here talking today about government regulation of the private sector. That's an issue that I think also ought to be addressed, but it concerns me even more that the government, which is in a different place than any private company, because a government can use data that they gather to do all kinds of things, to regulate you, to tax you, to charge you with a crime, oftentimes wrongly charging you with a crime based upon information that may suggest something, but turns out to not have indicated that you were just in the area when something happened and you pinged off of one of these devices, and there you are. You have a situation, all kinds of information is gathered by a powerful government entity, federal, state, or local, that can then use that in a whole host of ways that a private business, a private company can't do. And in fact, ultimately depriving you of your liberty by charging you with a crime, convicting you of a crime. Oftentimes people are guilty of these crimes. And I don't have any objection. I don't think you have any objection to government using this kind of information as long as they follow the rules, including the United States Constitution and the requirement that you get a search warrant in order to gather information about people.
If you don't mind me staying on stingrays for a moment, I mean, one, couldn't agree more with what you just said. And actually, just to emphasize it, I get this question all the time. And for context, I do hill-facing work. So I meet with offices, I meet with members of Congress. I make this case. I make the case for reforming these issues to those people. That's my particular role for Demand Progress. I get the question all the time of, why do you care so much about the government doing this when we have, Madison Square Garden, as we were just talking about, doing this. And as Bob said, only one of those actors can arrest you and put you in prison. You cannot get away from that fact. That is a fundamentally different dynamic. There's no opting in when it's the government. It is just the government. And then two, there's the rules ahead of time, and Bob, I think you did a good job laying out exactly how important that is. On the other side of conducting the surveillance, there are also rules, and we see huge issues with that as well. And stingrays provide this particular example. There was a case in Baltimore where a pizza delivery guy got robbed, and obviously not good, obviously a crime. We're all there. The police showed up at somebody's house and found pizza and cash and the gun that was used. Luckily, nobody was shot, but obviously incriminating evidence. And they collected it, and they've got this guy who obviously they say is going to be the person who committed the crime. The trial is where the issues start to unravel. They bring an agent up to testify to say, here's how we found this person. And he will not say on the stand how they found the robber. And so at a certain point, he says something fascinating, which is, I signed a non-disclosure agreement. And the judge said in response, you didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement with the court. And the challenge to the prosecution, to the people who were calling this person and wanted to use this evidence, was, you can tell us where you got the information that led to the arrest, which is extraordinarily standard. I mean, I can't even believe that a prosecutor thought this would be an out, that the non-disclosure agreement would be adequate. Um, but in any event, you can tell us how you got this information, or you can withdraw this evidence. And the prosecution withdrew the evidence. That non-disclosure agreement was with the manufacturer of stingrays. That is really bad. That is really bad. And it really, not only does it create situations like that, which are, borderline Kafkaesque, absolute credit to that judge for putting pressure there into the defense for knowing how to force that issue forward. But it also puts intense pressure on these agents to, let's say, manipulate the truth, to obscure what's really happening underneath all this. And that is, I think, a very frightening thing indeed.
Yeah, very, very well said. Very few countries in the world have a Bill of Rights or anything like a Bill of Rights in their constitution like we have. And consequently, very few countries in the world have the same kind of protections against unlawful search and seizure that we have in our constitution. And you can see by looking at other countries, and they vary around the world, but China obviously is the example people look to the most of what can happen when you take all of this technology we've described here, plus more we haven't talked about, and more we probably don't even know about. And it exists all over the world, not just in China. In fact, a lot of what's used in China was developed in the United States and other places. You take it and deploy it the way the Chinese have, and you have the perfect totalitarian state. It makes George Orwell's 1984 look like a pretty simplistic picture, looking back on that compared to what we know, and again, a lot that we don't know about how China not only surveils its citizens, but controls them in many, many ways using that technology, and certainly intimidates them using that technology as well. So we're not in any way suggesting we're in that place in the United States, but we are suggesting that these kind of abuses, if they become accepted standard practice, will lead to more and more government surveillance and government abuse of our citizens' freedoms.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's where I used to be more focused on the transparency side of things until I kind of came to believe that was a little bit of a sleight of hand, let's say, by the government. But the lack of transparency that we have seen around these practices, all the way from the Stingray example to, let's say, abuses of FISA that weren't disclosed until much after the government started to abuse the law and the Fourth Amendment. That is very alarming, because what it means is that the issues that the government doesn't think they will win in the public's eye on, they in practice keep it secret, and that's really not the way it's supposed to work. And it, I think, creates a very dangerous slide in the direction that you're describing, Bob. And then more specifically, I was thinking about this. Obviously we are not China right now. We would like to believe, I think we'd all like to believe, that the government still looks at people when they know something wrong has happened, which is sometimes more true than others. But in any event, for everybody who I think should be worried relative to what China has done, the data is there. The data is there, and based on, especially, I think, recent revelations, the data is also available to the government, and available to the government in ways that don't look anything like the standard Fourth Amendment process that we are used to, and that I think every American imagines protects them. That is, I don't think the framers thought that there would ever be an industry designed to, basically, slide this information over to the government. And I think we're going to get into that momentarily.
Let's do it. Let's do it right
Yeah.
now. So your work on Capitol Hill relates very much to that. Talk about some of the things that some members of Congress are working on, some of the legislation that would address some of these concerns, and start with any bill you want to, and I'll throw in a few for you to comment as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think the most important piece of legislation on surveillance, not that it's a race and not that they aren't all really important and great when they're coming from the right people, but I think the most important development on the Hill in recent history is the Fourth Amendment is not for sale act. And I give tremendous credit to Senator Wyden, but again, to the point of this being bipartisan, Senator Lee, Senator Daines, Representative Davidson, Representative Lofgren. These are people who have clearly tackled these issues or are interested in tackling these issues. But diving into what the issue is, I mentioned before that I don't think the framers imagined that there would be an industry designed to slide information over to the government that it couldn't otherwise acquire with a court order. I think that I think most Americans expect that if the government wants to have information about people in the United States, that the way that the government does that is by going through Fourth Amendment standard process, going through courts to get orders, going through the statutes that Congress has passed. And in fact, I've been having the work that I do is it has been FISA focused for nearly a decade at this point, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is, I think, one of the most abused pieces of legislation over time. What we have found out recently is that where 10 years ago, we learned about, or almost 10 years ago, we learned that there was that the government was using basically a subpoena grade authority, Section 215, to collect every call record, every outgoing call information, not the call itself, but the who you called, how long you talked to them, maybe where you called from, not at the time, but nowadays. And was doing that en masse to the major telephone providers. And so that was the bulk metadata, bulk telephone metadata program. Didn't look like anything anybody was familiar with up until that point, except for something called Stellar Wind, which is a big nut to crack, but also thankfully was shuttered over the course of 2007. In any event, fast forward about 8 or 9 years, and we start getting, basically we start seeing a lot of evidence that the government has tremendous amounts of records. But also over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, the concept of what a record is has exploded. There are so many different pieces of little data about individuals that it makes it really creates a question around, is content of a communication the most sensitive thing about us? If you have a million data points about an individual's life, you can learn almost anything from about them that you might have otherwise figured out from extremely invasive surveillance that would have required a warrant. And so where is all this going? Well, as you might have been able to deduce from the fact that the bill that I think is just really an important focus for everybody going into 2023, the Fourth Amendment is not for sale act. It turns out that data brokers, nobody's favorite industry, have a side hustle that is just extracting information from Facebook, from Google, from any given website potentially, and selling that information to the government. And it turned, I think most people wouldn't have thought this could be legal, but it turns out that there's a loophole where Facebook couldn't sell this or give this information to the government. If they give it to a data broker, a third party on its way to the government, apparently that's fair game as far as those actors in the government has concluded. And on the flip side, the government has concluded that as long as they're buying it, instead of seizing it in an extremely narrow sense of the word, that it's not a Fourth Amendment event. But really importantly, this isn't, once this happened, we're talking about an unknown but clearly extremely large volume of information affecting an unknown but extremely large number of Americans. And so we went from 10 years ago to, the government is clearly abusing the Patriot Act. I don't think there was anybody who really seriously thought that the bulk telephone metadata program could stand up as legal. 2 courts held that it was illegal and strongly suggested it was unconstitutional. Fast forward 9 years, and basically the government's saying, well, it doesn't count if we're buying it.
That's very concerning. They even have, in a recent revelation just came out last week, a situation where the data broker provides the information to a nonprofit at a public university that then the law enforcement agencies, the FBI, can go and tap that information with that nonprofit organization that's supposedly doing research, but actually basically a cover for government to get a hold of information that under other circumstances courts would require them to have a warrant to get a hold of.
Yeah, I think what's happening, what you're describing let me put it this way, it's still an unfolding story. I think anybody interested in these issues, there couldn't be enough attention paid to this right now. I mean, if the whole that I just described is exploited as Bob just described, we need to get on top of this. That we are already years too late. Congress in particular is already years too late getting its arms around it and putting rules and safeguards in place, and frankly banning the entire practice. I don't see any real reason why this should be permitted at all. But in any event, a lot of Congress isn't even looking at this or isn't even aware of it. Bob, the example that you describe, this appears to be a next. I don't want to get over my skis here because I think it's pretty explosive stuff. I think we are talking about. There is a government during the Michael Sussman trial. The government stipulated, which means agreed to certain facts with the defense, that there was an internet service provider named called Neustar, Neustar, that was selling to the government internet records under both unclassified and classified contracts. And so classified contracts, that's just code for intelligence agencies. We've never seen this. It hasn't really been picked up by major media yet. I think that's only a matter of time. How this plays into exactly what the dynamic is as far as like the Sussman trial, but not just the Sussman trial, just everything around it, I think is still unclear. But we seem to have a situation where, like Bob said, a nonprofit kind of thing existing at Georgia Tech with a concerning but unclear relationship with this other entity called Neustar, such that they are buying troves, it looks like millions of dollars worth of internet history or internet activity records. And then on top of that, the most recent thing I have seen is that there are DARPA emails going back and forth, talking about particular information they'd like to find out of it. Like I said, I don't want to get out ahead of my skis, but you can't do that. You can't sock puppet your way through the Fourth Amendment. The idea that any of these entities are selling the information is itself pretty unconscionable, no matter whom they're selling it to. But if they're selling it to the government, if the government's ultimately getting access to this, it's all the more concerning for all the reasons we've already talked about. I want to flag two things, if that's okay, Bob. One, Senator Wyden sent a letter to the Federal Trade Commission saying you should look into this with a specific focus on Neustar merged with another company, and that other company had said we will not do anything like whatever I just described. Right? I don't think we have words. We don't have terms for all of this yet. And therefore, there's an antitrust, there's an unfair and deceptive business practices angle to this issue, which I think is great. I mean, I'm a big fan of Lena Khan at the FTC. I hope that they look into this. But what it really does is substantiate that there is an issue here, that there is a pipeline that we are not talking about, and that is very, very invasive to potentially every person's privacy. Yeah, so that's huge. Two, so Senator Wyden and that FTC letter is really worth looking into. And then, well, I'll leave it there. I just want to draw attention to that letter. I think that's a big letter, and I think we need to build from it. And I think Congress needs to realize that they have a critical role to lead to. It's not just Senator Wyden. Every member of Congress should be up in arms about it.
Well, absolutely right. And we're running low on time here. Before I give you a minute to bring up anything you want to, let me just mention a couple things you may want to comment on. One is the FISA court and how it operates. It is of necessity because you're talking about the government going in and requesting authority to surveil. In this case, they are getting warrants. But when they do that, there's nobody in the court who's looking after protecting the people's general rights against government surveillance, their Fourth Amendment rights. And legislation has been offered, bipartisan legislation by Senator Pat Leahy and Senator Mike Lee, a Democrat and Republican, who want to make sure that in high-profile cases involving political campaigns or religious organizations or civil rights organizations, just to name three, that the court appoint a friend of the court, someone who has security clearance, and they're not representing the target of the warrant. They're representing the general public's interest in making sure that what is represented to the court by the FBI or some other government agency is in fact worthy of the court issuing a search warrant. So we're hopeful that that legislation will move forward in the new Congress. And finally, say a word about Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which expires at the end of 2023. What does that do, and why should Americans be concerned about that when its main focus is on foreign nationals outside the United States?
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the Leahy-Lee amendment, as I like to call it, but also it's called the FISA Amici Curiae Reform Act of 2022. The Patrick Leahy and Mike Lee are huge champions. I'm sorry that we won't have Senator Leahy with us in Congress next year, but he's obviously made a tremendous record for himself being a defender of the Fourth Amendment. And we're looking forward to seeing that mantle be picked up and driven forward. Obviously, Senator Wyden's a huge leader here too, but there's a lot of space for members, I think, to lead this forward. And the amendment or the law that you're talking about, very bipartisan, so bipartisan it got 77 votes in the Senate in 2020, which I think it does more to speak to the appetite of for reform of members of both parties than any other data point. When this stuff actually gets to the floor, we win. The Fourth Amendment wins. The American public wins. Privacy wins. And I want to hit that point really hard as kind of the prism to look into the rest of what you just mentioned, because that is what we are heading into next year. It's going to be a debate around Section 702, which is, I think, fairly described as the most controversial surveillance authority, at least in the FISA foreign intelligence context. And that's because it does something that nothing else does. It puts a hole in a very specific provision of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that basically says if it's an American's communication, you're only getting access to it through a warrant. And that is a big deal. It's one of the only provisions that we've really seen stand the test of time. I think arguably brought down stellar wind, that thing I mentioned earlier. It is, I think, probably the most important provision of law that's passed, not just in my lifetime, but going back to I guess Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover, as far as surveillance goes. And so the significance of it is it means what it says, and it's written in a very clear way. The 702 basically says you can get the communications of foreign targets, foreign intelligence targets, if they are held in the United States, and you don't need a warrant. All you need to do is basically assert that it's related to a number of pre-approved kind of blanket, these look so much like general warrants. It's unbelievable. But basically the government has to say, well, this relates to weapons of mass destruction or counterterrorism or espionage or cybersecurity. And then, okay, yes, plug in, this email, and when you go to Google tomorrow, they have to give you all the emails they have. Well, it turns out that process produces a lot of Americans' information, a lot of communications with or from people in the United States. Over time, there have been other issues as well, but just keeping it, quote unquote, simple, that is really at the nexus here. And so, that itself kind of goes, oh, that's not great. That's specifically not what the government's supposed to be doing here. It gets way worse because the FBI gets access to some of this information and then specifically looks for U.S. person communications there. So they wouldn't have been allowed to do this on the front end. They couldn't have targeted the U.S. person email address or phone number or whatever it is at the front. That's written into Section 702. But the FBI still ends up with a lot of this data, and at the end of the day conducts, it turns out, millions per year of queries using selectors, email addresses, things like that, that they know belong to an American. And if that isn't a runaround, I don't know what is. And so this is a very, and to make it just a little bit more for folks who have been following these issues for a long time now, if you've heard of the term PRISM or Upstream, those are programs, surveillance programs that exist under Section 702. They're kind of big umbrella things. So just a little bit that you can look into if you wanted to dig farther. That authority, the authority that authorizes it, is considered, the government likes to call it the crown jewel of their surveillance powers. I have no doubt it's important. It comes up for sunset. It's scheduled to expire. It's such a powerful provision of law that the Congress said you're only going to get this for 4, 5, 6 years at a time. And so the end of 2023 is the next expiration. And what that means is there was going to be a ferocious debate. And Bob and I were very up close and personal with the last reauthorization debate around Section 215 of the Patriot Act. These are the only two. 215 was matched with 2 other provisions, but they get a lot less focus, and I'm just going to leave them to the side for now. They're called the lone wolf provision, the roving wiretap provision. In any event, 215 and 702 really are the marquee. We are talking about surveillance this year. Congress has to reauthorize the Patriot Act. If you've ever heard that, this is the process we're talking about. 702 is part of something called the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act 2008, but it's even worse than Section 215 because it gives this direct access to communications themselves. And so the government cares deeply about this. We have massive concerns about it. But if we scope out, and Bob, please feel free to drive this. I know we're running out of time, but I want to offer a framework for folks. When you scope out, one of the biggest issues, this is like a practical reality for those of us who try to change policy in Congress. What's hard is getting a vote. And Section 702 means there will have to be a vote. And so everything else becomes caught in this dynamic where where surveillance hawks want to keep the vote as narrow as possible. We are only going to talk about the expiring authority, and we're only going to talk about it when it is expiring. And ideally, we're not going to talk about it any more than absolutely necessary to get a reauthorization. That's what the intelligence committees want. And unfortunately, what they've kind of decided is their role in this process, which, I think would make Pike and Church roll in their graves, frankly. But in any event, what we will be doing, or at least what I'll be doing, is saying, there's a lot here, and you have not allowed any of us to vote on it. You have not allowed Congress to vote on it at all. I mean, we should have known before the government started buying information about potentially millions of Americans. And instead, because you insist on having the debates in this manner, what we're going to do instead is make sure that this comes up, make sure this is part of the conversation as Congress decides whether to reauthorize Section 702 at all. And when I say ferocious, I think it will be ferocious. In the 2019 and 2020 fight, the seemingly permanent sunset of Section 215 of the Patriot Act was considered impossible. I mean, I literally had that word used to me directly many times in the weeks before the sunset, and in fact after the sunset, and we still haven't seen it come back because these things are not popular, because Congress doesn't really love these things. So the rank and file members of Congress realize something is up. So we are going to try to make sure that this upcoming 2023 fight is big enough to address all of these very big issues that the government, and I think some members at least of the intelligence committees in Congress, and certainly every administration in recent history, has tried to just sweep under the rug. It is way too late for that. At this point, we are talking about an entirely separate pipeline that anybody knew existed, that basically makes the bulk telephone metadata program look, potentially like a joke. You're buying the records about Americans' internet activity potentially en masse, and you're doing it from the least popular industry known to man. That's an issue, and Congress is going to have to vote on it next year. And just to make sure that a particular term enters this conversation, anything that happens, any surveillance that the government conducts that is beyond the scope of statutory authority, Section 2702 and these other things, happens under what's called Executive Order 12333. It is the executive branch's kind of guidebook for what is allowable in terms of surveillance that affects Americans when it's conducted for foreign intelligence purposes. 12333 is broken, and it's kind of this it's a shell game. It's a shell that hides whatever the government wants. Oh, you stopped us from conducting bulk surveillance under 215. Let's just make sure you never find out about the bulk purchase of information under 12333. And the truth is they will win that fight in the absence of very serious pressure from Congress, because Congress doesn't vote on 12333 because it's not a statute, and judges won't ever hear about it either because it's not a court order. It's not an authorization from a judge. So this is, I think, going to be a year for surveillance reform unlike any that I have lived through next year. And I hope anybody who's interested not only pays attention, but demands that their members of Congress dive into this in a very serious way and lead the fight forward.
Well, Sean, that's very well said. And we have run out of time. So I hope you'll come back and join us again as we move through next year and see how Congress is addressing these really important issues. And we hope you and Demand Progress and other groups will keep up the good work on Capitol Hill to bring this matter to the fore. You might want to say a word about how people can contact Demand Progress about these issues.
Thank you. And for the record, happy to. Big fans over in Demand Progress of Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability. And Bob, I think the world of your work, really. So it's an honor to be here with you. To the practicality of talking to Demand Progress. So we're a national grassroots organization. So certainly would love to have any of you who are interested. This will be a priority for us. We live at demandprogress.org, perhaps unsurprisingly. Folks are welcome to reach out to me if they're interested. I'm Sean, SEAN, at demandprogress.org. Nothing too complicated there. And we've got a lot of work ahead of us. So I'm looking forward to diving in with you.
Well, thanks, Sean. And we can be reached at the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability at protectprivacynow.org, protectprivacynow, all one word, .org, or just search PPSA or search Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability. And again, I'm Bob Goodlatte, and thank you for joining us today for our podcast.